Good morning, students. Welcome to the Tucson Botanical Gardens. We're here with Nora, our Sonoran desert tortoise, and we're also here today with naturalist Jeff Babson. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Tucson Botanical Gardens. My name, like Katie said, my name is Jeff Babson. I'm a naturalist with Pima County Natural Resources, and I also own my own eco tour company, Sky Island Tours. And we're here on a glorious spring morning to talk about Sonoran desert tortoises, of which Nora is a female and a wonderful representative of her. Okay, so you may have heard the words tortoise and turtle and may not know what those words actually mean. So here's an easy way to remember. All tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. So tortoises, the word is usually applied to fairly large turtles that mostly live on land. They're not going to ponds or streams or anything like that. They're walking around on land, living in burrows, often in arid or dry parts of the world. Turtles, generally, when most people think of turtles, they think of turtles they see at ponds and streams where they're swimming around. They have the webbed feet. They can hold their breath for a long period of time. They'll crawl out onto logs or rocks to soak up the sun. So that's a key difference between a tortoise and a turtle. Nora here is probably not very good at swimming. She doesn't need to be. That's not where her normal habitat is. So that's a difference. Another way is to look at the hind limbs. The back legs, they look like the legs of an elephant. Whereas on a typical turtle, they're very short and they have very webbed feet. Their feet are almost like paddles to help them swim through the water. That's not going to be the case on Nora. So that's a main difference. But remember, all tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. I've done that for a while. Looks like she's kind of cropped it down pretty good.
Yeah. Having some breakfast, Nora.
Okay, so tortoises and turtles are famous for the shells that they carry. Their shell is made up of their backbone, their rib cage, their shoulders, and their hips. And they basically form something like a box to hold the soft parts inside. And on top of the bones are what are called scutes. And those are sort of like our fingernails. And so when you look at a turtle, you're looking at the scutes. You're not actually looking at the bones. And there's basically two main parts of a shell. You have the top part, which is a fancy word for its carapace, and then you have the bottom part, which is the plastron. And the two are linked together on the sides between the front legs and the hind legs by another part of the shell called the bridge. And the bridge basically forms the pockets where they can pull their legs in. Shells are a fantastic way to protect yourself from predators. If you were an adult tortoise like Nora, your main predator in the desert is going to be something like a mountain lion, perhaps a black bear if the black bears come down low enough. They're the only animals that have jaws strong enough to crack the shell. If you're a hatchling, let's say you're only a few months or a few years old, then a lot more things can eat you, like snakes, bobcats, coyotes, other potential predators could feed on you. But once you get big enough and old enough, that shell is pretty good at protecting you from any potential predators. And you can actually tell a male tortoise from a female tortoise by looking at the underside of the shell. The males have these shields that come out farther on the neck than the females do, and the females on that underpart, that plastron, they have a little dent. And that's how you can tell them apart. I do not recommend anyone go out to grab a turtle or a tortoise, because it's affecting them. And in tortoises' case, they may void their contents of their bladder, which is where they store water during the dry parts of the year. And then if they do that, you could impact that tortoise's ability to survive in the desert. Okay, so what does the Sonoran desert tortoise eat? Well, they're vegetarians. They tend to feed on things like grasses, like Nora was just doing, the leaves of trees and shrubs. If they're hanging down low enough, they'll feed on cacti. They really like cacti fruit because of the nutrition, but also the water. And so when the prickly pear fruit are available, they'll get their faces covered in the juices, and they look like they got a purple stain on their face. So they're not eating animals, they're not eating like insects or things like that, they're eating plant matter. Now, Sonoran desert tortoises, like many tortoises, don't live in groups. They're sort of solitary. They live off by themselves. They have their own burrows that they dig, and they really only get together in any sort of group sense during the monsoon season, and that's when the breeding season is for. That's when males go to find females. They'll mate, and then they'll go their separate ways again. And that is usually in July and August in southern Arizona. But what's really interesting to me is that the eggs will not hatch. She will lay the eggs, the female will lay the eggs in her burrow. Her eggs will not hatch until June or July of the following year. So those eggs don't hatch for almost a full year before we get the hatchlings that come out. So that's a very long incubation period, if you want to call it that, for an animal. For example, a snake that lives in the Sonoran Desert, like a gopher snake, for example, which is a common snake around Tucson, those eggs will typically hatch in about 3 months or so. In this case, it's about 11 months later before those eggs hatch, which is a really long period of time. So except for that period of time in July and August, when all that rain, well, hopefully the rains have come and there's lots of food available for them to eat, then that's also the time when the sexes will get together and create the next generation of Sonoran desert tortoises. So the Sonoran desert tortoise is not active above ground year-round. In fact, they really only have 2 periods of time during a year when they're active. One is right now, the springtime, when temperatures start to warm up, but it's not real hot yet. And this is a time when the tortoises will emerge from hibernation. They'll go out and they'll feed. They'll replenish the energy they lost over the winter time. And that usually it can start as early as late February, but it's more typically like in late March, early April. And they'll stay active until about early to mid-May, when it starts to get really hot. And then they'll go back to their burrow again because they want to avoid the heat. And then once the monsoon starts, typically late June into August, they'll have this other period of activity when they'll emerge, they'll feed. That's when they'll mate. That's when they'll drink water if it's available. So once the summer rains come again, they'll get out, they'll feed. That's when mating occurs. That's when there's a lot of vegetation to feed on because of the rains. That's also when they'll drink water. They'll drink as much as they can when it's available. And they'll do that until usually October-ish. And then they'll go into hibernation. So they'll go back to their burrow and they won't emerge until the spring again. So hibernation is a period of time when there's not much food available. The temperatures are not very good. So reptiles like a tortoise the old word for that is cold-blooded. That's not really that accurate because their blood isn't actually cold. It's just not at a constant temperature. So if you're cold-blooded and it starts to get chilly, then you'll want to retreat. So that's what they'll do. They'll go into their burrows and then they'll emerge again in the spring. Sometimes the males actually won't emerge at all until the monsoon season. They'll just sort of continue to sleep right through the spring. But most females will emerge in the spring from late February until usually about April, and then they'll be active for a few weeks, and then they'll go back underground again. And when they're hibernating, they slow their metabolism down. They don't need a lot of food. They're not like a mammal that's going to go gorge itself, eat as much as it can to get through the winter because it's keeping that body temperature constant. Tortoises and other reptiles don't have to worry about that. So since their body temperature is not kept at a constant level, their body temperature can drop, and they don't need to eat as much before they go into hibernation. So again, they're active in the springtime, and then they're active again during the monsoon season, but in the really hot part of the summer and also the winter time, you're not typically going to see a tortoise out moving around. So desert tortoises spend most of their time in their burrow, as we just talked about. They dig their own burrows. They use their front feet sort of alternately to sort of kick the soil back. And they usually are into rather sandy or rocky soils, and that's where they'll do their digging. They're not real deep. They don't go many feet underground. They usually only go a couple of feet, and that's where they'll spend the majority of their time. That's where they'll hibernate. That's where they'll get out of the summer heat. That's where the females will lay their eggs. So they often will use burrows that they dig themselves, usually at the base of a rock or maybe a tree or a piece of grass or something like that. There's usually something above the burrow and they kind of go under it. They will also use other existing cavities, like in a rocky area where there's a ledge that they can get into far enough back. It might go a couple of feet back and they can get out of the elements that way as well. So they don't always dig a burrow, but they mostly do. And like I said, they use their front feet alternately to move. They're kind of like they're swimming a little bit, and that's how they move the soil out of the way, and they dig their own burrow. Once the tortoise has dug a burrow, it's basically making a residence for a lot of other animals as well. So things like tarantulas, for example, scorpions, mammals, like some of our desert rodents, lots of animals, other reptiles, snakes and stuff will live in there, and they often get along quite well. Those animals are not predators of the tortoise, and the tortoise isn't interested in eating them because they just eat plants. And so they get along quite well, and that's actually an important resource for these other animals, is to have access to burrows that are made by the tortoises, and it gives them a place to hibernate. Just like the tortoise also gives them a place to get away from their own predators or to get out of the heat or maybe a flash flood, something of that nature. So the tortoise burrow is not just used by the tortoise that dug it, it's used by a bunch of other animals at the same time. Once the tortoise has dug a burrow, it's basically making a residence for a lot of other animals as well. So things like tarantulas, for example, scorpions, mammals, like some of our desert rodents, lots of animals, other reptiles, snakes and stuff will live in there, and they often get along quite well. Those animals are not predators of the tortoise, and the tortoise isn't interested in eating them because they just eat plants. And so they get along quite well, and that's actually an important resource for these other animals, is to have access to burrows that are made by the tortoises, and it gives them a place to hibernate. Just like the tortoise also gives them a place to get away from their own predators or to get out of the heat or maybe a flash flood, something of that nature. So the tortoise burrow is not just used by the tortoise that dug it, it's used by a bunch of other animals at the same time. So for a long time we thought there was just one tortoise in Arizona, and it was just called the desert tortoise because it lived in the desert. In 2011, it was determined by scientists that that was not the case. We actually have two different tortoise species in Arizona. South and east of the Colorado River, so the Tucson area, has the Sonoran desert tortoise. And in far northwestern Arizona, up where like California, Nevada, and Arizona meet, there's the Mojave desert tortoise. And they differ in various ways. Their genetics are different, their genes are different. The Sonoran desert tortoise tends to lay one clutch of eggs, usually about 3 to 12 per year. The Mojave desert tortoise lays more clutches, up to 3 clutches, but smaller number of eggs. And also there's different, the shape of the shell is different between the two species. So this is exciting because this was only found out about 10 years ago. The two tortoises look pretty similar to each other, and the best way to tell them apart is where you're standing when you see it. But if you're up in the northwest corner of the state, you have a different species than we have down here in Tucson. So both species of desert tortoise in Arizona are protected under state law, meaning you can't like take them from the wild and keep them as pets or anything like that. However, if you see, they're common enough where it's easy to see them. If you're out on a hike through the desert, or maybe in your neighborhood, you'll see them. If you see a tortoise, appreciate that animal for the wonderful creature that it is, but don't pick it up. Don't try to make it a pet because, first of all, it's illegal. Second of all, the tortoise may void the contents of its bladder during the summer. That can be really detrimental to them because they need that water to survive. So you can admire them, maybe take photos if you like, but don't try to pick it up. Don't try to make it a pet. Leave it be. It's perfectly fine where it is. It's spent millions of years in the Sonoran Desert, so it's, you know, and it's been here a long time. It can survive really well, but don't pick it up. If you want to help with Sonoran Desert tortoise conservation, you can adopt a tortoise. These are tortoises that there's an abundance of them, and maybe the habitat is filled, there aren't any more available territories. And you can do that, but it's not an easy thing. You have to keep the tortoises outside. You have to have an enclosure where they can't escape. You have to have native plants in there for them to feed on. You have to have a place where they can get out of this, like not a burrow necessarily, but a home where they can go to get out of the summer heat as well as the winter cold. So it's not something to take lightly. It's a great way to sort of share your yard with the tortoise, but it requires a commitment of time that may last years, because you can't, once you adopt a tortoise, you can't release them back into the wild. They're your outdoor, just like your landscaping in a way, they're your outdoor sort of obligation at that point. And you can contact Arizona Game and Fish, you can contact the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum on the process on how to do that. But do not, under any circumstances, take a tortoise you see in the wild and move it into your yard, because that, first of all, it's illegal, and second of all, the tortoise probably won't do very well, because it's not where it doesn't have a home to go back to when it gets really hot. So it's going to need a lot of things, but you can do it if you make the commitment to do so. So thank you everyone for joining us at the Tucson Botanical Gardens. We really hope that you enjoyed this introduction to the Sonoran Desert Tortoise. Please come to the gardens and visit, say hi to Nora. She'd be very excited to see you. And this time of year, the best time to come is in the morning, because Nora is active then. As it gets warmer, she goes back into the shade, sort of like what we would do. So come in the morning, she'll be out, hopefully she'll be feeding at that time, and say hi to her. She would love to meet your acquaintance.